Brigado. So 1979 marked Althusser's ability to get him a
Did Michael self-disconnect or?
I got cut off. Okay. So as I was saying, 1979 marked, I think, a crucial turn in French intellectual thought. And two moments, of course, and I mentioned the first one being Negri was given a space, Tony Negri, who, by the way, is very sick right now, is, I think, on a respirator, unfortunately, in Venice. But anyway, a major contributor to my way of thinking to the Marxist tradition and to militant practice, major figure post 1968 and before, of course. But anyway, Negri was giving lectures on the Grundrisse, which were very anti-traditional readings of the Grundrisse Marxist notebooks written in 1857 to 1858. And a major new reading of the Grundrisse, I suggest, if you're interested in Marx's notebooks and in going further into depth about what he was thinking during a period of financial crisis. This was a major crisis in the European banking system. The Grundrisse is worth reading, and Negri's lessons, 10 lessons on the Grundrisse, are an absolutely, in my view, a superb reading. He really tackles the essential problems and has a very different way of interpretation than the tradition, like Roman Rodolsky, for example, who wrote The Making of Marx's Grundrisse. And then, of course, the person from Mexico, Dursel, who also had a reading of this through a kind of third world lens, or through, an anti-colonial lens. But again, I think Negri's reading is certainly worth reading and studying. The other moment is Foucault's lecture, 78 to 79. I think this indicates a turn in both Foucault's thought, getting away from the studies of the abnormal, psychiatric power, the prisons, etc., and launched a kind of new discipline, which is pretty much matter of fact in some departments, not so much in the United States, but certainly in Europe and in other countries. Australia has strong departments as well, and some other places in South America, especially in Chile. The birth of the biopolitical and biopolitics as a discipline that would both be a supplement to Marx and the Marxist tradition, but really would be a break in a certain way by no longer studying just class and rates of exploitation, or for that moment, a commodity fetishism, but beginning with this new category called the biopolitical, which also included bio-racism, because a way Foucault had a tremendous fascination of how the Nazi National Socialists came to be and how they were able to control for so long. And as we're learning from the Free to Obey book, how much of it remains with us today, a lot of this thinking. So Foucault's fascination is definitely there. Those of you who have seen Pasolini's film, Salo, and I'll relate a funny story about that. But anyway, that Foucault is cited at the end alongside Roland Barthes, Gilles Deleuze, and Georges Bataille as sources for Pasolini. So Pasolini does just not write cinema, or direct cinema, or write screenplays, or just write poetry, or write essays. And he wrote a treatise on linguistics. He also studied the recent theory very actively. So it's kind of an interesting moment in this study of the Nazi, well, mostly the fascist mind, because it's set in Mussolini's France, but it could be transposed. So anyway, with that, I mean, again, we're only reading the last two, and one of the reasons for the choice of the last two lectures is that he revisits this concept of Homo Economicus. And I think this is very important for us to understand this shift to Homo economicus, and also as a transition to which we're trying to do, the new switch to Homo Datum. I learned today that AI is both writing resumes and then judging. There's no human being involved anymore in terms of resume build, So AI is now writing the resume, and then AI sees if the resume fits. The bosses are giving AI the credibility and the ability to judge the resumes. So that's the new hiring practice out there, that's coming out where we are. So anyway, with that said, I just want to mention some of the figures here that he mentions early on. He mentions B.F. Skinner, and I know Skinner is not read often anymore or talked about much, but this was a major figure in terms of the Harvard moment with Norman Wiener and others. The behaviorist psychology movement and behaviorism as a philosophical movement, and include the book Beyond Freedom and Dignity being one of its statements, but earlier verbal behavior, and then of course Walden 2 is his utopic example of behaviorism playing out. So this is the one who basically, how it appears for Becker, on page 70, and then this relationship of Skinner to the English empiricist moment, and how dangerous a thinker he is, but how prominent he is today as well. So this is very, very important to keep in mind, the Skinnerian behaviorism alongside, the formation, if you will, of Homo economicus and economic calculation and economic rationality as it goes today. So I want to definitely point out that name and that figure of part of what we're doing here. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about, and then I'll turn it over to Arto. I'm sure he has many good ideas. A couple of other people, and I really recommend this book too for those of you interested in institutional critique. Robert Castell's book, The Psychiatric Society. It is available in English. He wrote it in French, and he talks about behavioral techniques. And I think this book, even though dated from the 70s, is still very important. The implementation of methods, both experimental and then an economic analysis of behavior. No longer is behavior just psychological, etc., but an economic analysis of behavior. And this Castell has a very brilliant chapter on behavioral techniques in that book, and Foucault mentions him on page 270. And then of course Becker, who we'll get into more and more how important he is, and then going back to human action of Ludwig von Mises and political economy. And the thing that struck me early on is the notion that Foucault has of Homo economicus, which is very different than how we take it up, and this economic analysis of behavior and how it ultimately, plays out so much in our everyday lives, with that unwittingly and wittingly, as we know, right? And then the two principles I would like for us to maybe go to those as well, is the principle of the irreducible, non-transferable, atomistic individual choice. What choice becomes in this moment of the biopolitical, unconditionally referred to the subject, which is called interest. What is interest for Foucault? And how do we look at this again beyond just self-interest and economic interest? What is he ultimately talking about in terms of the subject of interest? So Arto, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll mellow down a little bit. I just got off the road coming in, so I'll let you take the floor with some of your thoughts. And yeah.
Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, these lectures are, incredibly, as we know, incredibly rich, and kind of, as I reread it now, I found them even more radical than I initially assumed, in the previous iteration of reading. And what I tried to do was, just as a proposal to the seminar, was I kind of focused on a few sections. Maybe I'll start with the first one, which is the opening pages, and then just came up with some very initial kind of heuristics or very initial questions, about how what Foucault is thinking through here might illuminate what we're trying to think through about: is there a transition from Homo Economicus to Homo Datum? Is there such transition? Is it useful to think about it, or are we still in the terrain of Homo Economicus? And broadly speaking, in Foucault's field of kind of investigation, we may be, right? And so I just had some initial questions, and also maybe some very initial kind of attempts at kind of trying to imagine moving beyond the field of Homo Economicus. If we simply replaced economic analysis, what he calls economic analysis, by which he means the kind of positivist form of political economy, which left the field of political economy and became known as econometrics, or kind of neoliberal economic analysis. And if we replace that with socialized cybernetics, which is not at least in my case, it's not a very well formed concept. I mean, that's part of my problem, that I still myself don't have a good working version of socialized cybernetics as the grounding of contemporary capitalist kind of ideology, or the emerging ground. If we still live under capitalism, two of my friends just emailed me. They're like, "Have you read Varoufakis's latest book on techno-feudalism?" And I haven't, but I will. I've watched his big video. I think there's like an hour-long interview where he gives stakes his case that we are basically transitioning away from capitalism as we know it, and shifting into new political formation. I'm not sure if that's true, because I simply have been struck by that argument of his right now. So I'm still like, trying to make sense of it. But I think one way to begin is just at the very beginning of the first lecture, the next to last lecture from 28th of March in 1979, where he makes, I think, the first important point, and it's a point that's to us obvious now, 40 years later, but I think it's still very, very infused with suggestions, and he says at the very beginning of the lecture, he says, "Today I would like to start from," anyways, the last sentence of page, that would be page 267. Foucault writes, "Last week I tried to show how American neoliberals apply, or at any rate try to apply, economic analysis to a series of objects, to domains of behavior," and he uses the word behavior, I'm sure, deliberately, to domains of behavior or conduct which were not market forms of behavior or conduct. They attempt to apply economic analysis to marriage, the education of children, and criminality, for example. This, of course, poses a problem of both theory and method. The problem of legitimacy, like, can you do that? Can you take a particular specialized field of social science? I mean, economic theory of this kind is not a science. It has basically no predictive abilities, as people have half-jokingly stated. But that doesn't matter. That's a secondary point. It's called a science, but can we apply Chicago School economic theory to the field of education, or to the field of criminality, as he says, or to the field of marriage, right? In other words, this is a methodological question too. Like, is this kind of sloppiness where we derive an understanding of the world by using particular, type of mathematics applied to questions of, the economy in large? Can we take this insight that we've gained from this kind of very narrow technical positivism and generalize it across everyday life? And of course, we can't, and we shouldn't if we were careful economists and etc. But we certainly should if we are in a position of power, and our goal is to generalize and transform everyday thinking. If our goal is essentially to form hegemony of a new kind, we're going to impose this kind of thinking as the lens through which if it's up to us. Everything will be thought through in life. And if we did that, then hopefully we can reshape the intellectual field, and thus by this kind of intellectual superiority, project some kind of a political hegemony and rule thereafter for 1,000 years or more.
Arto,
So, yeah, of course. Yeah, anytime.
Yeah, just for a second. Yeah. Just to go down a bit, because I think you really hit on a crucial passage where he's going to speak about methodology that's so prominent here and how he does this. This would be on the next page, 292, or maybe I can just continue. Try to show the atom of interest could not be superimposed on, was not identifiable with, and was not reducible to the essential characteristics of the subject of right in juridical thought. So the whole discourse about human rights, humanitarianism is being subjected here, again, to scrutiny. That Homo economicus and the subject of right were therefore not superposable. And finally, that Homo economicus and the subject of right are not integrated into their respective domains according to the same dialectic. That is to say, and this is very interesting, that the subject of right is integrated into the system of other subjects of right by a dialectic of the renunciation of his own rights or their transfer to someone else. While Homo economicus, right, is integrated into the system of which he is a part into the economic domain, not by a transfer, nor a subtraction or dialectic of renunciation. You know, you can see how he's going against Hegel here as usual, but by a dialectic of spontaneous multiplication. So I think this is very important to understand that this is how this Homo economicus works, you know, across so many fields, right? And what we're really dealing with here. Yeah. And
it's interesting because to me, it also sounds that liberal power, liberalism is the political ideology of the capitalist class of the European imperial formations, but soon thereafter extended through the various comprador bourgeoisies, if we want to use that term, which in Bulgaria, I can guarantee you, is very much active in its classic phase. Bulgaria today is essentially, the place where I was born and grew up, and under state socialism, as it's called, right? Today is essentially a comprador bourgeoisie kind of client state. And you can literally see the validity of that classical analysis of imperialism through the functioning of Bulgarian political elites. They're literally comprador bourgeoisie. So I kind of experienced for myself kind of like a factual manifestation of that concept. So I think, liberal, capitalist power functions not through dialectic. Consciously in the practitioner sense of the word, it actually functions, Foucault saying, through this form of multiplicative reasoning. This kind of naked brute power imposition, for example, in intellectual life of a economic theory, which is then generalized as a general sense-making apparatus for all other areas of political and social, political and economic life. So Homo economicus is made possible by a certain type of economic theory functioning as an organon, right? In the Aristotelian sense, an organon, that through which you make sense, that through which you can strive to uncover the truth, right? And thus to make reasonable sense-making, your sense-making apparatus, which doesn't have to be true. But if you have power, you can impose sense-making apparatuses that are very deficient in terms of them being meaningful in the application of, in terms of what they say about the economy's functioning or how public education should be structured or whatever. So I think that's an interesting point. And on page 268, he says that he repeats this 2 more times just to make this point, which it must be important to him, right? He's troubled by this. He says in the middle of page 268, he says, so there is a problem of the validity of the applicability of this grid of Homo economicus. There's a problem when you do this, but it's being done. And he says, actually, the problem of the application of Homo economicus has become one of the classics of neoliberal discussion in the United States, and et cetera. And then the next paragraph, he repeats it again. He says, this problem of Homo economicus and its applicability seems to me to be interesting. Like, why should we care? Because I think there are important stakes in the generalization of the grid of Homo economicus, the domains that are not immediately and directly economic. And then finally, in a couple of sentences from further down on the bottom of page 268, but behind this identification of the object of economic analysis with conducts involving an optimal allocation of scarce resources to alternative ends, we find the possibility of a generalization of the economic object to any conduct which employs limited means to one end among others. And of course, today, I stumbled upon, recently there was a manifesto published in kind of ruling capitalist, the subset of the capitalist class that is in a dominant position, social cybernetic kind. So there's this capitalist by the name of Luis Andreessen, and he is the part owner of a very powerful hedge fund, tech fund that gives capital, invests capital in various startups over the years. The Andreessen Horowitz, not hedge fund, but venture capital firm. And Andreessen is an important kind of an innovator on the capitalist side, on the investor side, because he's the co-founder of Netscape. Netscape Corporation that invented the first graphical web browser in the early 90s. They did it by essentially using the code that was publicly available from the University of Illinois National Center for Supercomputing Applications. And now I'm forgetting the name of that browser. It was the pioneering graphical web browser, which made web browsers accessible to non-computer scientists. I know this because I was a student at the University of Illinois in the mid 90s, studying in the computer music, right? So they had this incredible program there where you could study computer science applications for the generation of music, like algorithmic music and etc. So I know the story where the Mosaic web browser was the first generally available graphical web browser, which was instrumental for allowing the internet to leave the science labs and to become ubiquitous, to become generally used by normal human beings who weren't. And Phil, of course, would remember the Mosaic, Netscape, and etc. Because Phil, you worked, a long time in computers and etc. So Netscape essentially acquired the Mosaic code and then commercialized it, improved it, or whatever. And Andreessen became a millionaire, and then now he's in a position of political influence. I'm going to post the manifesto in the chat in case you haven't read it, and if you'd like to take a look at it. Let's see. I'm going to post two documents, actually. They're interesting in this. So this is the techno, and maybe we could read this. I mean, maybe we could discuss this if people take a look at it and find it interesting and useful. So this is like a techno, but it's interesting because you see what Foucault is talking about here. You see this kind of, the immediate question that emerges from this first page of Foucault is, let's see, I scribbled something down. He says, so in other words, if economic theory has to do with the optimal allocation of resources, and then it is assumed to be sort of a way of looking at the world of great explanatory power, and then we can extend it and generalize it to other parts of life, what does socialized cybernetics have to do with? The socialized cybernetics as a political sense-making, as a political ideology of the capitalist class today, or an emerging ideology, what does it have to do with? Does it have to do with, obviously it doesn't have to do with the optimal allocation of economic resources. What does it have to do? So I think I didn't have an immediate answer to that question, and I feel like I should, right? Because this is suggesting itself. If socialized cybernetics, if you read the Andreessen Manifesto, it's filled with concepts derived from cybernetics, right? It engages with AI. It engages also with questions of intelligence measured by, in this kind of like computational cognitive neuroscience, which is hegemonic in the study of the mind today. But it also includes concepts from neoclassical economics, right? It talks about optimal allocation of resources as the only way forward, right? So it's kind of like the fusion of Homo Economicus of kind of Chicago school, like Milton Friedman economic logic, with the language of cybernetics research and its application to computer science. And this is basically the intellectual cornerstones that are used in the Andreessen manifesto. And this manifesto has made huge impact. A lot of people are talking about it in computer science circles, in startup circles, in venture capital circles. It's been criticized, it's been supported, etc. And one of the ways through which it's been engaged with, I'm going to post this other link now, is by this other type of cyberneticist who is now dabbling in politics, is starting to write programmatic pieces in that are dealing with economics, politics, etc. But he's doing it in a way that's kind of like the embryonic form of socialized cybernetics, kind of like when insights from computer science technicians they're extending their insights to questions of social organization. And I'm going to post this second manifesto, and this is by Vitalik Buterin, who's a Russian emigre. He lives in Canada, I believe, and he's the author of Ethereum, the cryptocurrency, but even more importantly, the crypto platform, right? The Ethereum crypto coin. The Ethereum is the Ether is the cryptocurrency which makes possible economic transactions, if you will, and or any other generalized social transactions on the Ethereum blockchain, right? So this is a long piece, and he has several of these. A couple of years ago, he wrote a political programmatic document on how to imagine a more equitable society of the near future, where socialized cybernetics is the dominant. I mean, he doesn't use that language, but where socialized cybernetics is the sense making, is the organon for making sense of the world politically, socially, but the technical language is the language of econometrics and kind of computer science, kind of mathematics, right? So these are, I think, two prototypical embryonic. They're not the only ones. They're just the most recent ones that I'm aware of this kind of socialized cybernetics that's being articulated. So then the question emerges: what does socialized cybernetics have to do with, right? If it doesn't only have to do with the optimal allocation of resources. So in other words, if we are transitioning to Homo Datum from Homo Economicus, of course, we'll go back to the crucial passages that Michael also read about Homo Economicus in the Foucault lecture. I just want to propose initially, what does socialized cybernetics have to do with? And of course, the most immediate and probably the easiest answer is that just the way Homo Economicus deals with the question of interest, and as we'll see later, and the displacement of the political for the very narrow economic category of interest, and Foucault talks about John Locke and kind of the displacement of the political. We're going to see how in the vision of the liberals, because this is really what the liberal project is about, political categories are useless, or at best they're secondary. They're not true. Politics is displaced also in Foucault's reading of liberalism in Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand, which I found incredible. I just never thought about it that way, and I should have. And it's incredibly profound. The invisible hand, actually, I wrote this. Let's see. I'll find the passage of the invisible hand for Foucault. I mean, it's disqualifies the political sovereign. Right. And we'll get to that passage because it's kind of incredible. Ultimately what he's saying, I don't want to jump the gun, but what Foucault is saying, that liberal ideology, if the liberals are left to be in a position of political power, makes it impossible for society to exist as such. Right. So the political community as such, if we're still in the world of Aristotelian grounded politics, which is Marxist politics as well, because Marxism very much builds on in terms of the political conceptualization of the political, not only, of course, I mean, I'm staying within kind of the Marx's own reading of Aristotle, but also, this is not the extent, conceptualization of the political, but there's still the concept of the political community, which is the grounding of how we make sense of the world, right? And everything that entails. And all of a sudden, Foucault is saying, the invisible hand, the most profound liberal thinkers were very much ready and willing to replace the fundamental political categories that they inherited in their society with something else. And it basically, what it means is that liberal societies are devoid of, there's no society in the liberal calculus. So if you take a look at the United States, with very few exceptions, which were prompted by emergencies like World War II or Civil War or etc., liberal societies are not constitutive of, there's no society in liberal societies. It's Foucault's point here. There's just patchworks of little tiny, or larger than tiny, or however we want to formulate, little particular collectivities. But the entire project of social formation and etc., what Kant was writing about, the European Enlightenment and all that stuff has been successfully subverted in actual politics where liberals dominate. And this is a separate topic to talk about as a deconstruction of capitalism and in its hegemonic phase, which is liberal. It's a very powerful way to deconstruct the liberal project by saying, look, your very ideology prepares and sets up a profoundly dysfunctional state of affairs, which must not be allowed because it'll just create massive human suffering. But that's to get just a
Arto, just go to one thing that I think will illuminate even more what you say here too, and it's very relevant. On page 269, he speaks about Becker, and this is in the middle of the page, the second, the first full paragraph. Becker says, basically, economic analysis can perfectly well find its points of anchorage and effectiveness if an individual's conduct answers to the single clause that the conduct in question reacts to reality in a non-random way. So the elimination of any contingencies, right, and any chance, etc., any kind of, rebellion, if you will. That is to say, any conduct which responds systematically to modifications in the variables of the environment. In other words, any conduct, as Becker says, which accepts reality must be susceptible to economic analysis. Homo economicus is someone who accepts reality. Rational conduct is any conduct which is sensitive to modifications in the variables of the environment and responds to this in a non-random way, systematic way, and economics can therefore be defined as the science of the systematic nature of responses to environmental variables. I think this is very crucial to understand the activity of everybody from the Washington Consensus to the Trilateral Commission, as well as today what is that place, Davos, the Davos Group annually as well. So this is very, very important in a sense. Yeah.
No, totally. And just to follow your point, Michael, it's better maybe methodologically to go through the major points of Foucault before we come up with some very speculative kind of outgrowths from it. So we should keep going. And on the bottom of page 271 and the top of page 272, when he talks about John Locke, I think he also introduces these other fundamental. And Arvind said in the chat, he quotes Ferguson. Of course, all these people are Brits, most of them. It's not accidental.
Scottish is
Scottish, British imperial product.
Right.
So Arvind says he's saying it is spontaneous social bond, right? Like the North American savages. I mean, it's like, it's just so rich in this kind of political ideology of imperial expansion and building that's underpinned by theories of race, there's no concept of the universal, of the total, of the I mean, you can see the contrast with the Napoleonic project, and you can see the total war between the British liberals and their French allies and Napoleon's kind of project. I mean, that's kind of like a side point. But on the bottom of page 271, what English empiricism introduces, let's say, roughly with Locke, the foundational philosopher, not Hobbes, of course, because Hobbes was very much centered on the political in a way that Locke is not, or is very different. So with English empiricism with Locke, and doubtless for the first time in Western philosophy, so this is the revolutionary aspect of capitalist politics, which is underpinned, and the condition of its possibilities, of course, also present in its philosophy, its systematic ways through which they made sense of the world, which precipitated their political victory, right? Which took some time. For the first time in Western philosophy is a subject who is not so much defined by his freedom or by the opposition of soul and body, Descartes and etc., or by the presence of a source, or this, I think, is an extremely important point, that by the presence of a source or core marked to a greater or lesser degree, next page, by the fall or sin. All that stuff is secondary or simply abandoned as irrelevant, but who appears in the form of a subject of individual choices, which are both irreducible and non-transferable. And probably not probably, but surely to the 17th, 18th century mind, hearing this kind of articulation of this idea was probably something coming out of space, or something extraordinarily vulgar or shocking. Right. So in other words, we can see here that political subjectivity is now in liberal philosophy reduced to or defined as individual choices, which are both, what kind of choices? Irreducible and non-transferable. Right. And I added here, based on minimally sufficient binary logic, because he goes through Hume's argument, right? Because Hume shows and derives what is the meaning of an individual choice that is irreducible and non-transferable. It's simple binary choice, death, life, etc. Based on a minimally sufficient binary logic, stripping most of the ambiguity that offers meaning to humans, or this kind of unsolvable but yet desirable to solve kind of yearning that drives people's creativity, for example. It is the logic, I think, of just straight up business, a particular type of business transactions, bourgeois business transactions, transactional logic, which is in its very essence stripped to its most bare necessity. It's very direct. And we can add, if we push this kind of line of reasoning, this is machinic reasoning. The kind of algorithmic, if you will, clear-cut, always, the ChatGPT will always give you an answer, right? It's always going to say some yes or no, or here's the essay or whatever. It's not going to say, I don't feel like it. Or if it does say that, it's programmed to say that or simulate, right? So maybe, Michael, you want to come in here as well, but what is this individual choice that is both irreducible and non-transferable? Because this is the core of how the liberal mind, and thus liberal politics, and how the capitalist economy itself, from the point of view of the capitalist, makes sense, and nothing outside of this. And you're going to see this logic active in the Tech Manifesto by the by the capitalist Andreessen.
Right. I was just going to say, I mean, what you read in this kind of background here of irreducible and non-transferable is really his definition, his working definition of building the concept of interest, which is very different than how we usually see interest. He says the subject himself, which is called interest, this is what becomes part of, and listen, I'll do this, I mean, just a little bit, just as a reference. Of course, English imperialism has all these new concepts going on. Remember, Locke was, a board member of the Royal Africa Company, right?
And didn't he write the Constitution of South Carolina or something?
Yes, he did. Yeah, part of that, yes, as well. And, also was a part of the currency crisis,
Yeah.
in the treasury as well. So these are not, small minds. I mean, just like, it's not like these idiots we parading around on TV today with this cult of the experts. These are people very much engaged in the world and also, making contributions to governmentality, to use Foucault's notion. And then he says, this is very interesting. What I think is fundamental, and I'm just going to go on with what you said, because you kind of laid the very nice ground to where he's going to make a new concept, right, for us to think about in terms of the biopolitical. What I think is fundamental in English empiricist philosophy, which I am treating completely superficially, typical Foucault, right, is that it reveals something that absolutely did not exist before. Right? So this is the moment. The idea of a subject of interest, by which I mean a subject as the source of interest, the starting point of an interest on the site of a mechanism of interest. So all of these things are working at once, the subject, the site, right? And of course, the source, right? For sure, there's a series of discussion on the mechanism interest itself, and what activated is it self-preservation? Is it the body or the soul, or is it sympathy? But this is not what is important here anymore. And again, he's taking on a tradition in philosophy who asks these questions: what is the body? What is the soul? He says what is important is the appearance of interest for the first time as a form of a both immediately and absolutely subjective will. I think this is very, very important to see that this break in the 18th century into the 19th century, the subjective will is born. And the problem, which gets us the problematic of Homo economics underway, is whether this subjective interest or form of will called interest can be considered as the same type of will as the juridical will, right? In a sense, because he goes back again, he's going to go into Blackstone. I mean, we're in the presence, whether you like Foucault or not, you've got to admit the archival research that is going on, as Arto was saying, this is unbelievably amazing how many connections, what he's really doing in terms of reading the archive. He's going to go into Blackstone. We can say, although interest and the juridical will cannot be completely assimilated, they may be perfectly well reconciled. And at this fact, we see from the end of the 17th century up to the middle of the 18th century, in a jurist like Blackstone, a kind of mixture of both juridical analysis and analysis in terms of interest. For example, when he addresses the problem of the original contract, and this goes back to what you were talking about, Arto, or the social contract, he says, why have individuals entered into the contract? They have entered into the contract because they have an interest. Every individual has his interest, but in the state of nature and before the contract, these interests are threatened. So to protect at least some of their interests, they are forced to sacrifice others. Very, very interesting, right? The immediate will be sacrificed for more important and possibly deferred. In short, interest appears here as an empirical source of the contract, and the juridical will thus formed. The legal subject who is constituted through the contract is basically the subject of interest, but a purified subject of interest who has become calculating, rationalized, and so on. If you'd like somewhat loose analysis in which the juridical will and interest are mixed together, intertwined, generating each other. And Hume notes it's not like this and that things are not this and that things are not so simple. Why Hume says, do we enter the contract? Out of interest. Again, you enter the contract out of interest because you realize if you were alone and had no ties with others, your interests would be harmed. But once you've entered the contract, why do you respect it? Right, etc. So I think this opens up a whole, new way of thinking about doing history, right? This genealogical, archaeological, method that he's implying here, right? And building the necessary correlations between, the juridical, right, and power. And earlier he's going to take on the sovereign. He's going to take on the sovereign as well, in its role too. So yeah, but I'll let you go.
No, I mean, so in
yeah.
other words, the subject is the source of interest, and that is the irreducible, non-transferable core. That's the foundation of the political in liberal dominated in liberal, in capitalist society. So in other words, what is the non-transferable? That is that thing in us that is not transferable. You always have it. It's the core of your human nature, that which is irreducible. You cannot, if you reduce the discussion to the core, the most important political right or desire that you have, the liberals will say self-interest. That's the fundamental yardstick. That's the fundamental lens through which, that's the most important human capacity or human yearning, your interest, to uncover your interests in a particular situation, to act upon your interests, to act in the interest of your interests. It's, in a sense, it's an extremely impoverished take at the question, what does it mean to be human? To reduce human beings and to say, of all the things that activate and move us and make us do things and feel things and etc., of all the things that keep us at night, the irreducible one, that which you cannot remove and still be human, is simply narrow individual self-interest. Now, of course, that's not surprising if you're trying to articulate a political fight, of your social class, against a different social class, which, has different justifications for its hold on power. But still, if you really believe this, if this becomes your yardstick, your organon, and if you impose this upon society, if this becomes part of the ideological state apparatuses that are replicated ad nauseum in schools and education systems for centuries, and it produces catastrophic impoverishment. I think this is one of the things that Heidegger probably found most disgusting in liberal societies. This kind of reduction to the totality of the complexity of what does it mean to be human. I mean, he's within the European tradition of, et cetera, grounded in Aristotle and the pre-Socratics and et cetera. But this kind of reductionism that the liberals do, I mean, the great liberal minds did, right, is catastrophic. It has catastrophic political, social consequences, because you're essentially reducing the human. What is it? The question to the answer, what does it mean to be human, is reduced to narrow self-interest, which can take any dimensions, even extra economic, of course. But I think it opens the ground. I think this is what the pioneering theorists of cybernetics, but also follow-on second, third generation theorists who are making sense of these technologies, these kinds of technologies that didn't exist or existed in Foucault's time, but they were still very much in labs, or they were very much still in the military-industrial complex, but they were not generalized, right, throughout society. I think we can make a very easy extension of this and basically say, yes, socialized cybernetics, if there is such a thing, very much assumes whole in the capitalist domain. Again, there's an entire tradition of socialized cybernetics, which started to be to leave the labs, but it never really reached everyday life. For example, in the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union fell apart precisely in 1991, right before the internet was released as a general kind of computing network open to the population in general. So when I'm saying like this is a socialized cybernetic logic, I mean in the case of socialized cybernetics in capitalist societies like the United States, or England or whatever. And I think there's a certain natural succession of this logic of the non-transferable and irreducible self-interest, which is transferred into the beginnings of what is socialized cybernetics, that we see the outlines of, for example, in these manifestos that are appearing more and more frequently, as capitalists too are trying to make sense of what are the implications of the technological breakthroughs, and of course, we should always keep in mind what Heidegger said in the question of technology, that technology is better understood as a way of making sense of the world rather than just as a techne, narrowly understood. So I think if we were to extend John Locke's point that liberal subjectivity is the subjectivity of individual choices, which are both irreducible and untransferable, because if you violate somebody's interest, whether it's understood as economic interest or otherwise, you're violating that one thing that is fundamental beyond all the other things. What does that produce if we extend it into logic? This does not encourage dialectical thought, right? This is not view of political subjectivity that leads itself to dialectical logic, right? But it does lead itself to, or if we extend it maybe even dogmatically at first, political subjects, or the political subject defined as irreducible and non-transferable individual choice. This opens the ground to a logic, a way of reasoning that you can call minimally sufficient reasoning, right? So, what is the minimally sufficient reasoning for a particular political subject to reproduce themselves socially? I think that's the generalized that's the logic of the generalized proletariat. So the generalized proletariat survives and reproduces itself tomorrow through minimally sufficient reasoning. An example of minimally sufficient reasoning is, I think, the educational outcomes that are designed in the Common Core curriculum of public education in the United States, for example. If you follow that kind of, if we were to look at some of the core elements of the Common Core curriculum, especially as it's taught in working class schools, where the generalized proletariat, to use Stigler's language, lives. These studies have been made. The pioneering study that I'm aware of in the United States was by Gene Anion, the great educational psychologist who taught at the Graduate Center, who studied how and what kids learned in 3 different types of public schools in New Jersey in the late 1970s, exactly when Foucault's writing this. And she published a book, if I'm forgetting the title of the book, but the conditions were there are 3 different types of public schools differentiated by social class. So in one school you have the kids of the AT&T executives, members of the capitalist class, or those serving the capitalist class, on the highest levels. You had another public school that was inhabited by kids of kind of highly paid working class members, managers, mid-level managers, etc. And the third type of public schools that she studied were inhabited by the working class kids and proletariat in general. And she very clearly showed how the curriculum at the working class school essentially taught minimally sufficient reasoning in their kids. Solve this math problem not because you aim for the truth, right? That was not breached in those lessons. Solve this problem because this is how you solve it, by applying the steps that the teacher wrote on the board, right? And if you generalize this through 12 years of education, you essentially reproduce, she said, the New Jersey working class the way it's been, that's the way it's going to be. Intellectually, you're not going to develop those kids' minds because every kid has the ability to be an intellectual, as Gramsci said. That's just part of the core fundamental human ability. By the way, notice the interesting contrast with Locke here. When Gramsci was writing about the political subject, one of the things he said is that everybody has the ability to become an intellectual. In other words, everybody has the ability to develop their mind and their sense-making apparatus and to read Shakespeare and to appreciate, John Coltrane and to learn Chinese, right? That's not a limitation set by, but of course, the liberal argument is never going to say that. Right? The liberal argument will recognize differences in educational outcomes. It will recognize them as perhaps undesirable, and then it will form a nonprofit to sort of put a Band-Aid on the worst, and et cetera. But
it's part of the problem, as not enough organic intellectuals were produced in order to affect that.
They were actively prevented from being produced. Right? So that's part of the political strategy.
Marxists or subversives aren't hired by major universities, to put it mildly, and many of the radicals end up in community colleges, at best, and then are relegated to some kind of generalized stupidity because nobody is willing to fight the core or fight what's going on, this job readiness, as you talked about, outcomes assessment for common cores and all of this. I was just going to mention too, alongside the book you cited, in terms of the public schools, the great book by Paul Willis, of which Aronowitz wrote the introduction, Learning to Labor, a very good assessment as well of working class education and this limitation that is there.
I think this is such an important point, because I think to say, like, if we want to call it doesn't matter what we call it, but one thing we could, yes, the Bollers and Gintis book. That was
I have it on the shelf behind me here. Schooling in Capitalist America. Why do we have a literacy campaign? So they could follow instructions in the factories, be able to read, how to work a forklift, how to put an automobile together, right? Follow the manuals. That was the literacy that was proposed. Yeah.
I mean, it's we've all heard of the Powell memo. I mean, these are not conspiracy theories, right? The Powell memo. Powell became a Supreme Court justice, U.S. Supreme Court, but before that, he was the chief lawyer, kind of like the chief legal mind of the U.S. Business Roundtable, where politically sophisticated and politically engaged capitalists regularly meet to strategize, right? To engage in to face systemic challenges. If we go back to that language of the systemic versus the, to engage with to confront systemic challenges to American capitalism.
We're going to be okay. The Koch brothers are putting billions behind Nikki Haley.
Of course.
Don't worry.
and the Business Roundtable commissioned Powell to write a study and report to them how they can regain control and kind of put an end to the troublesome 50s and 60s in America, right? And the Powell memo was leaked to the papers. I forget which paper, the New York Times or Washington Post, doesn't matter. But the Powell memo was leaked, and Powell basically said what was the cause of the 1960s in America, right? This period of radicalization in America, which was successfully, of course, absorbed, especially through the suicidal tendencies of the New Left, but that's a side point. And Powell said the fundamental problem was that the American public education system emphasized too much the humanities for the working class. There's no need for the working class to be educated well in the humanities. Well, what are the humanities? The humanities is, to use the Hegelian language or the Marxist language, it engages in the teaching of universals, engages in totalizing conceptualization of society, of what does it mean to be human, right? It teaches you, develops your intellectual mind if it's done appropriately, right? Even if it's done inappropriately or incompletely, it's still qualitatively vastly different and superior in that sense to a narrow task-based education, which teaches and encourages only minimally sufficient reasoning to develop, and not kind of its opposite, holistic or thinking to emerge, right? So, and Powell said we got to cut liberal arts education in America's public education system, because the public education system is overwhelmingly, the working class is overwhelmingly present in public education, of course. So he said we need to cut the humanities education and public education, secondary and also college. And literally after that report, you had a series of educational reform proposals from the Ford and Carnegie Foundation. There's a great PhD dissertation that was written about this and subsequently turned into a book by a San Francisco-based teacher. I forget her name now. She's it's a remarkable book because she went through the empirical data and she found all these reports and she showed how this was a deliberate political strategy, multiplicative political strategy, the way Foucault talks about it. So here's the goal. Let's implement the goal. How? nonprofits, foundations come up with an actual mock or proposed curriculum, which is going to gut the liberal arts and replace it with something else, which is conducive to produce minimally sufficient reasoning in working class students. And then the state governments are encouraged to vote on it through, through bribery. I'm forgetting the word now. What's the official bribery called in the United States in political offices? Lobbying, right? Through lobbyists. And then virtually, New York State, for example, I know this for a fact because I was a high school teacher when this was passed, the reform, early 2000s, right? It took 25 to 30 years in its genealogy to leave the Powell memo to the Business Roundtable, to go through the Ford Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation, to be written by their educational experts, to be introduced in the New York State Assembly, to be rejected a few times, and then to be voted in. It took several presidential administrations before it became the Common Core, right? So I think this concept of, if we try to imagine what it means, this core of liberal kind of political ideology with the non-reducible, I think we can paraphrase it to minimally subjective, minimally sufficient reasoning. And I think this is what liberal politics has in store for everybody except the ruling class, because the ruling class, and Arvind made this point too, that these great philosophers, Ferguson and Adam Smith and John Locke, they were speaking in double language here. They were addressing in my view, what needs to be done once they acquire political power to remain in power. They need to create the conditions for minimally sufficient reasoning to be the lingua franca of everyday life, but not for the ruling class, or at least not for the thinking members of the ruling class, where they will reserve for themselves the full arsenal of human thought, and thus the elite liberal universities did not gut the liberal arts curriculum, very consciously. The University of Chicago might be teaching minimally sufficient reasoning as the best way to make sense of American economy and international, trade and etc. But if you are a student at the University of Chicago, you're going to get the Aristotelian grounded liberal arts curriculum. So there's I think there's kind of a double game being played in Locke's and kind of Adam Smith's and Ferguson's. Their intended audience is both themselves, they're members of their own social class, but it's also a blueprint for how to be in power. Once you acquire power and you get rid of the remnants of the aristocratic order that are not transitioning to becoming bourgeoisie themselves. So I think I think this is a question here. If liberal political philosophy, and thus everything that follows from it, grounds itself to these two things, the non-transferable and the irreducible, defined and understood as self-interest, if that's the ground of liberal political philosophy, what would be the ground of the next stage in the development of liberalism, which would be a socialized cybernetics? So if socialized cybernetics is replacing economics as the sense-making foundation, what would be its fundamental concepts? I have a feeling it's data, because data is also an irreducible object. It's an already existing and already formed object, which is resistant to thinking, and it's resistant to sense-making beyond the narrow parameters that led to the formation of the data object itself. So I think provisionally, it seems to me that an interesting line of inquiry in this question could be, what is replacing self-interest, or what is replacing interest as the foundational category of contemporary capitalism? If we say that data is replacing that, it would make sense to conceptualize data. Like, what is data in the sense of its political functioning? If we simply hijack Foucault's method and go through the same archival, genealogical, multiplicative kind of logic of addition, and think strategically about our findings from the archive, is it valid? Is it correct? Or is it meaningful in the political sense? Does it give us a new way of fighting against the capitalists today intellectually, first of all, right? To reject the category of interest and replace it with the category of data. I don't know.
I think
My sense is this is a terrifying development.
Yeah.
Because it's profoundly dehumanizing in ways that Locke could not even imagine. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of racism, new faces of racism that are emerging if you replace the category of human-centered interest to interest that is replaced by data. Now we're in the world not of citizens and humans. Now that the foundational basic unit of analysis is becoming social objects that are digital in nature, which may not be necessarily human, but which have social implications. Of course, this is a pharmacological object, just like everything else. These digital social objects can be force of good, if you will, or a force of continued racism and alienation, etc. But that's just my question here. Does it make sense to extend, if we extend the non-transferable and irreducible from interest to what? It could still be interest today. We may still be in the orbit of Foucault's thought and reading.
Yeah, Arto, I was just going to mention, and then you can address the questions in the chat. I think we're on to something here based on your own thinking too with Foucault, that Foucault is really, to me, speaking to the impossibility of a political economy because of this notion of the subjective interest, right? There is no possibility of really building community, a political community. Politics is taking on a whole new dimension. And as you know, war, politics is war, right? In this sense. And I think we really need to keep this in mind. And I just wanted to mention another thing too. In the manifesto, just to go back just a little bit, that you put up the first one, I think his name, correct me if I'm wrong, what was
Andreessen.
Andreessen, yes. And he has a quote from the novelist who I knew personally, Walker Percy, author of The Moviegoer, Love in the Ruins, Lancelot, among other, and an essayist who was an existentialist humanist. I had many conversations with Walker Percy. He was from Covington, Louisiana, came out of Mississippi, and was a doctor, became a writer, etc. And I love the quote, and you have to ask the question, why would he begin with a quote from an existential humanist, who was educated by basically the reading while in a tuberculosis sanitarium, right, in North Carolina. He read Camus, Sartre, Gabriel Marcel, etc., Kierkegaard, Hegel, among others, and novels, right? We live in a deranged age, more deranged than usual, because despite great scientific and technological advances, man has not the faintest idea of who he is or what he is doing. This is Walker Percy speaking in the 1970s, right? Same time that Foucault is writing this, right? So this concern is really out there. And you mentioned earlier the technology. Foucault, after this work, started to work on technologies of the self. Right? He began to think of this. I think it morphed too much into lifestyle and these kind of things, but he did have that category that is maybe worth looking at, that, instead of the technology of the subject, which for him is the subject is important here because subject also leads to subjection. And Foucault is always interested in how the subject of interest becomes subjected as well as the subject of right. Right, or the subject of law. Where are these moments of subjection going on? So I think this is also very important to mention. And then just to address really quickly, Jeff, when he said about the professional managers, yeah, they don't need any education. All they need is to learn the language of cybernetics and management principles in some ways. They have no need for Shakespeare. They have no need for Goethe or William Faulkner or Herman Melville or whoever at this point. And this is why a generation of people, investment bankers that had some ability to at least appreciate art and a philosophy, have huge libraries. Like Soros has a huge library. And by the way, Soros's son did a PhD in philosophy at Berkeley. He's now in charge of the thing. He wrote on Jewish Dionysius for his dissertation, by the way, from Heine to Nietzsche, as George Soros's son, who's now in charge of the, whatever they call that hedge fund. I forgot the name, Quantum or something like that, was one of the big funds. So I think, it's important for us to see, and I think you did, a fantastic job on education and the Powell Circle, how long this takes, but once it hits, there's no turning back. Right? This is the amazing thing about all of this. That's so sad. Like at LIU, just to give an empirical example, the kids get a complete minimal sufficient reason is an exaggeration of what they're getting there, right? I try my best in my philosophy classes to point this out to them, but the thing is, they're also being indebted at the same time, not only miseducated, but what goes along with this is a new structure of debt, which has been laid on after the Powell memo or the Powell roundtable, as you pointed out. So this is very important to keep in mind, that the subject of law, of right, that Foucault is speaking about, is also working with the subject of interest. And then this whole thing of the slogan, be cool, stay in school, right? And somewhat this is a gateway to the good job, to the good, really a gateway to debt, in a way. As we all know, student debt has got more principal than credit card debt right now. Yeah, which is amazing. The interest on student debt in an annual thing is the amount of money being asked for, just the interest, to send to Israel. And then if you look at this a little further, you begin to see it can be accumulated also to Ukraine. Yeah, ultimately, what's happening in the defense budget? Where does this come from? Yeah. So I think this is always important to keep in mind, because Foucault is again fascinated about this whole thing. How do we become servile? How do we become subjected? And he's going to always go into this. And yeah, again, Homo Economicus, in a sense, is a way of having us, quite into putting us into this new subjection, and yeah.
And it seems, this may be a vulgar kind of way of reading it,
okay.
but the more you think about it, it seems like once you deconstruct a society or a community, or, and with this kind of radical atomization and radical kind of individualism, right, which, you make the conditions for possibility for politics emerging in a sense that's desirable, some kind of a polis, or some kind of a political community, or a new Soviet person that is going to be something completely different than the totally isolated, completely underdeveloped and completely kind of objectified humans that existed in the Russian Empire, for example. Just to make that parallel, it's impossible to have politics in the sense understood by Aristotle or Marx or Rousseau if you live in the liberal world. But the profound political, strategic, ideological move is that everybody learns in school that the American Revolution and the Federalist Papers and the Constitution were about creating a new society. It's not. It's the political community is the worst political enemy for people like Adam Smith and John Locke, or the people that their social class. This is what I'm getting out of Foucault's very kind of elegant and non-confrontational way of setting up a very profound confrontation with liberalism. Maybe if he wasn't French, if he was like some other, he would have been more direct and be like, fuck the liberals. These people need to be, exterminated, because they're literally dangerous for life on Earth, for humans and others, because they're destroying deliberately the social fabric in their pursuit of this kind of strange idea of radical individual self-interest, right? Which is the condition of possibility for capitalism. where after all, a tiny percentage, which is the capitalist class, rules with an iron fist, if you will, over the entire planet. I mean, how do you do that? That in itself, that's an incredible thing. But to go back to the school, because never cease to marvel at this, like, how do you produce minimally sufficient reasoning in people? How do you prevent people from intellectually fully developing? I mean, if you look at any modern university, for example, in the United States, public university, the typical student is confronted with a menu of choices as an individual. You go to school and you have to choose what major you're going to become. It's up to you, but that could be an overwhelming task. But you're not encouraged to, there's no community. There's just a bunch of people who come in and out and take classes, as consumers in a shopping mall, ordering cheeseburgers or drugs from a pharmacy or whatever, as individuals. And then the student is confronted with a menu, an overwhelming menu of choices of classes that fit in these categories, and there are many categories. And then they're like, okay, I want to study sociology. Okay. And then the person says, or the computer system says, well, you have a choice of 25 classes or 12 classes to take, but there's no connection between them, except they're grouped in these other larger categories, which are totally meaningless. And so what is the end result of this? Well, the initial end result is total disorientation. Just like Stiglitz uses that word, right? It's complete disorientation. And then the student chooses a bunch of random classes because they meet their schedule. And then they call that choice again, right? Choice driven by your interest. What is your interest? To get a degree and get a job. You need the degree to get a job. So I asked my students yesterday, what do you expect from college? What is the purpose in your mind of college education? And most of the students responded automatically, because how else could they not? They said, the purpose is to get a job. So of course that's empirically true, because that's the basic hard economic reality. People need jobs in order to survive. And then 2 of them said, or 4 of them said, well, to expand my mind. And they said, but I can't really talk much about it because everybody tells me that's a waste of time, because that's meaningless. Because what does that mean? You have to spend more than 25 seconds to expound on the meaning of what do you mean by to expand my mind. Whereas to say I'm in college in order to get a job takes 1 second. And it's perfectly clear to everybody what that means. That's the internalized liberal logic that Foucault is talking about. You already know, I need to get a job. So then what happens? A student goes through the motions of getting a degree, choosing a menu, choosing courses from a menu of choices, like they're in a restaurant. The connection between those courses is not apparent, and certainly not made clear to them, because they're not encouraged to think about the connections between the courses that they have to take. So the practical bottom line result of this is, yes, minimally sufficient reasoning to get a job and etc., but it also is profound disorientation and the sensation that you're alone. And this is exactly what the students tell me when they come to talk to me, the realization that they're alone against the world.
To add to this, what's been created is a whole new administrative class. The coach, who knows nothing about education, but how to fast track them out, how to get them to graduation. You need these credits, etc. There's no guidance at all. It used to be you might have an advisor in a department who would try to put together your schedule and help you, think about, interconnections between what you're doing. Now it's just about get the credits, get out, get the 120 credits, etc. And this has been created, a new kind of job creation. They're called promise coaches at LIU. I think at Brooklyn College they have another term. I'm sure at BMCC they have something too. Yeah, and of course, the joke is there's no promise in the promise coach. And there's no promise in education in a sense. You basically too, what's been produced now from this Powell memo, in a way, is basically a generation that's reading at probably a 6th grade level based on 1980s levels of reading, right? Yeah.
But then the question is
lower to the generation educated in the 60s and early 70s. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the question that comes up, which I don't know the answer to, but I would love to. hear an answer, or because it seems important, and is
Explore.
if we start from the conclusions of critiques of political economy by Marxists in the 1970s, 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that and we know the basic premises through which capital accumulates, and the basic ideas discussed by Marx, volume 1 and volume 3, etc. And then we talk about exploitation and surplus value and etc. The question arises today in the world of generalized proletarianization, how essential are the graduates of those universities for the reproduction of capital? How essential are for the production of surplus value the average members of offices in Midtown Manhattan? And where does, of course, we know, I'm not, of course there are answers to these questions, I'm sure, but today, right now, what are the sources of surplus labor? In other words, it must have to do with the notion of innovative labor, because that's what Microsoft research constantly talks about. This is what Google research talks about. And I think it has to do with, in a particular field of capitalist economy, let's say in a particular industry, the number of most of the profits, so to speak, most of the innovative labor that then translates into renewing the cycle of capital accumulation in a new way, and et cetera, and continuing the process, avoiding the crisis, pushing it down, is probably a very small percentage of the wage labor, much less than, let's say, 100 years ago. So what percentage of the workers of Microsoft, or workers / customers, because we are the data that goes into Facebook's and et cetera, but what percentage of Google's programmers, for example, are literally necessary and directly related to Google's, the owners of Google's accumulation of profit, of capital? And it's probably going to be a very small percentage. In fact, I read a statistic, Buterin, the Ethereum programmer, he cites the statistic that the company OpenAI, which builds ChatGPT, right, and other things, there are 500 people working in there. Yet, the labor of those 500 people directly impacts economically 1.5 billion people today. Right. So, in other words, what percentage of the generalized proletariat is actually necessary for the reproduction of the capitalist class, and what percentage is actually surplus labor, dead weight, that they might as well just go ahead and die? And if we go to the Klaus Schwab kind of musings in Davos over several years, and many years actually, in some of the volumes that are produced, including his own work, which he, I'm sure, co-authored with shadow writers who are actually doing the actual intellectual thinking, the Malthusian project is very well alive today, and that's like a background question here, that emerges from this kind of educational outcomes of minimally sufficient reasoning that it is inculcated in millions of peoples who are then joining the ranks of the generalized proletarianization. And then if you combine with that the Malthusian pressures that are constantly being hinted by people like Klaus Schwab and co. at places like Davos and the Santa Fe Institute, very, very troubling responses. And also maybe the recent responses to war that are being suggested. For example, the usage of the Ukrainian population is literally cannon fodder in a Malthusian sense too, because once the maximum number of Ukrainians die and Russians that live in that area die, all of a sudden that's the most fertile part of the European continent in terms of agricultural land. The Ukrainian Chernozem in Russian, Chernozem is the black soil. That is the most fertile in terms of agricultural production. There are two places in the European continent that are actually suitable for high quality food production. One is in Bulgaria / Turkey, the Thracian Plain, which is the premier agricultural land in Europe in terms of the quality of the soil. And the second, much larger area is specifically the area triangulated by Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia, and parts of Poland. Right? It's not an accident that the United European imperialists under Nazi leadership wanted to invade and colonize that part of Eastern Europe because that's where the food comes from, right? On a national and global scale, right? So anyways, that's just to take a diversion, away from, but I think the interconnections of the question of what does it mean to be generalized? We live in an era of generalized proletarianization. What's next for the generalized proletariat? What's the next stage of dehumanization? I think it's genocide. It's just a question of what form. That's definitely, I think we're entering, to be perfectly blunt, I think this question that I had for the very beginning, which was, which I want to return to perhaps, what does socialized cybernetics have to do with? Like, what are its prime political concerns? And one answer is augmentation of human beings in general through augmentation in memory. And, this is the kind of stuff that Musk's company, and there are all kinds of other companies are dealing with, augmentation of the human intellect, right? And the manifesto talks about that. We're going to be more intelligent by using AI. AI is like, is going to be smarter than the individual person because it's going to have a more powerful mind. Of course, we don't know what the mind is. Science has no idea what the mind is according to its own scientific procedures and methods, right? That's a side point. We have no idea what the mind is because the mind probably functions on quantum mechanical principles, consciousness, as people like the physicist David Bohm has argued, and then Roger Penrose today has taken this up, right? There's a whole field of theory of the mind as a quantum system that is laughed at by the dominant schools of cybernetic infused thinking about the mind as a supercomputer input-output machinery with memory capacity that's finite, right? And Roger Penrose and the really interesting giants of physics, including David Bohm, alternative interpretation of quantum mechanics and et cetera, that Einstein liked, and they say, no, the mind is quantum mechanical in nature. Well, then good luck, right? Approaching it through Newtonian statistical methodology or pre-quantum mechanical methodology. That means if David Bohm had this idea of hidden variables in science, he said every time science uncovers a fundamental theory about nature, you can already assume that there's a deeper underlying level that we are not aware of, which directly shapes the physical world that's accessible to us. And the moment we uncover one layer, be prepared for another huge roadblock that's going to basically be a huge roadblock for the next generation, maybe 300 years later, to uncover. And that's going to put a natural stop, so to speak, of your hubris, that you are in control of the universe, right? If you're a positivist of that leaning. So I think another way of answering that question, well, what is socialized cybernetics engaging with? Well, the other thing is a new politics of race, because the politics of human augmentation imply those who can be augmented, those who should be augmented, and those who most certainly should not be augmented, or whatever combinatorics of that you want. And now we're approaching for the first time the holy grail of racists and their political ideology, which is they can actually, the anthropological break, where they can actually point to certain groups of people and say, those are the augmented humans 20 years from now, and those others should not be augmented. For example, that could be one gradation, Phil said Larry Summers has been brought up.
Yeah, we can come back to this when we read Agamben, but maybe the preparation, the latest spectacle, of course, which is very real, obviously, and very close to all of us here, this Gaza, genocide that's going on live stream, may be a preparation for what you're talking about, that, to accustom the mind and reinforce behaviorally this tolerance for pain, and that this is actually going on. And this is, in some ways, the way people, some of these people actually think, in terms of how will the media present this, how will it happen, etc., and what does it do to the general populace? So it's not only an actual real-time war, but it's also an experiment in how far will people tolerate, right? How far will people take this, etc., right? And where is the, in a sense, measuring the rebellion, measuring what kind of resistance is really there. So I think this is good to keep in mind. And I think, later when we go to Agamben, we can return to this. But I think this is an aspect that, Foucault doesn't really get into about how conditioned, he mentions the Skinners, he mentions these things. But, what is this problem, this new notion of conditioning that's happening? As you propose, as you say, the Great Reset of Klaus Schwab, the new forms of racism, the argument, who is to be, does the West survive and the rest of the world not once again? What happens?
I think the question of what comes after the generalized proletarianization, if we follow Stigler's way of thinking or Foucault here with Homo Economicus, I think is a big question mark that deserves speculation, at least, if not, because we are living through some kind of a transition. Today, I know it's become banal, and but today I watched this video. It was part of the Telegram feed that I was following of two kids, I think it was in the West Bank, who were throwing stones. They were shot to death.
Yeah.
And so on one level, it's like, what the answer is. One answer is, well, it's war. People die in war, which is true. There's no distinction between civilians and combatants in total war, but there are different ways to fight total war. And some ways of fighting a war are more dehumanizing than others. I should say the Russia-NATO war until now has seen no systematic bombardments of civilian neighborhoods with the intention of erasing the buildings with the civilian population in it. That's not an accident. That follows from a certain logic approach to total war. That's the Soviet approach to war. Okay? But why would you shoot two kids who are throwing rocks at you when you are armed with a machine gun a great distance away? That's a difference. That's something different. That's the imposition of race. That's race. Racism is active in there. What is racism? Racism is the waging of, I think racism is, race war is a war that's devoid of the political. And if I really want to be bombastic, I'd say race war is the liberal way of war. That's a war waged by a society that has no conception of the political, that has deliberately avoided the creation of a political community because it's under the domain of a logic of Homo Economicus, where a political community would inhibit the freedom of action of the capitalist class. And when such a society fights a war against a vastly inferior enemy, it can do it by hiring soldiers. The British Army and its colonization in the 19th century, 18th century thrived through mercenaries and pirates, right? The British imperial expansion was made possible through pirates and through mercenaries and a very small professional military and collaborators that they bribed, right? So a liberal way of war, which must be a racist war because liberal politics presupposes racist politics because it's a politics of a society that there is no society, produces the worst type of war, which is a war that does not have the constraints of the political behind it. And in that sense, the Nazis were hyper-liberals, you could argue, in their style of management, as we know from the book we read. But in other ways, they were different from the liberals, but let's leave that aside. But I think, yes, the French Foreign Legion, like Elizabeth says, because the French were a liberal regime too in the 19th century. And they used the French Foreign Legion to do the dirty work for them. They used non-French soldiers in general, led by French officers, but the vast majority of the people who did the killing and took the risks and etc., and who died in that imperial expansion were non-French. So I don't know. So that was a terrifying thing to witness, because when when kids are shot, not because of the bomb that blew up their house, killed the kids, but behind the house was a tank that the enemy was storing. That's a qualitatively different way of the horror called war. But when two kids are deliberately executed from a position of complete immunity, and there is no global political outrage, well, there cannot be global political outrage because many societies in the world are poisoned by liberal political philosophy, and thus there's no societies in those societies. There's just Margaret Thatcher was literally true, correct. There's just nothing but a collection of various individuals and their little grouplets of individuals, and a vast mass of individuals who are just disoriented and just trying to survive. You can do all kinds of horrific crimes in their name or through them, including live through persistent, horrific urban crimes. Like I just saw the headlines today. 3 people were attacked and killed, I believe, right next to Philadelphia City Hall. Right next to the institution that is supposed to be presiding over Philadelphia as a community, as a society, you have routine deadly violence for no reason, right? Well, that's all liberal societies can do. Of course, it can also produce the beautiful private neighborhoods, the little grouplets of people who can live there, right? In a nice house, in a nice neighborhood, and etc., presided by private security or public security, the police that's functioning as private security when they pay special attention to keep those neighborhoods crime-free, etc. So I think Foucault can help us read liberalism in a very devastating way as a political ideology of antisocial, contra-political way of organizing society that can ultimately and very quickly produce a camp mentality. Maybe, I mean, Agamben is, as a reader of Foucault, I'm sure he's reading this as well. Liberal societies produce a camp-like society very quickly. Those who are inside the camp, those who are guarding the camp and are outside in a privileged position. It produces racism, because racism is just another way of preventing a society from emerging in Aristotle's sense, because a society that's divided along different races cannot emerge. There's no political community there by design, right? And that's a society that's going to very quickly engage in horrific violence within itself or against others as a way of existing, right? And if we read Federalist number 10, the foundational justification for the liberal regime in the United States, it's an extraordinary document, because in there it asks a question: what is the primary purpose of government? Fundamental political question. What is the purpose of government? And Federalist number 10, I forget who wrote it, Hamilton?
Madison.
James Madison. These people were very smart, and they were very honest.
Responding to Hamilton. And
they were very honest. So Federalist number 10 asks, what is the purpose of government, the primary purpose? And it answers, the primary purpose of government that we believe in, right? It says there are 2 purposes. One, to defend itself from all challengers against it. So there you go. Any government must, first of all, defend itself against all challengers against its own authority. Otherwise, it won't be government. It'll cease to be government, right? The second answer, essentially, which is kind of to defend and protect the naturally existing differences in society. What are those differences? There are differences in wealth. Why do we have naturally existing differences in wealth? The naturally existing differences in wealth come from the naturally existing differences in the human faculties, it says. The human faculties to be understood in the inherent differences in the human intelligence. So what do we have there? We have the justification for capitalist private wealth is that the capitalists are literally intellectually superior. Those are the people with the superior genetics who are smarter. They're just born that way. In other words, that's the master race. Okay? So there's justification for capitalist inequality, because inequality is genetically predetermined, is determined by God, essentially. right? Because these were particular types of Protestants who believed in predestination, and their interpretation of differences in wealth ultimately was grounded in predestination. Whether they believe that or not, it doesn't matter. They sold it that way. But here you have it. It's my interest is I need to keep my wealth intact, and that's my position of comfort and privilege. How am I going to do that? Well, it's in my interest to stay in that way. And from this kind of, that's not up for debate. That's not negotiable. My wealth and somebody else's suffering because of an absence of wealth, these are irreducible differences. They have to be maintained. And thus we proceed forward. We create a society where there's a very weak government, because otherwise there's always the risk of the majority who are non-wealthy of capturing parts of it and thus legislating me out of my wealth. That's always the possibility. So you're going to have division of power and separation of power in the American context in order to create a dysfunctional government from the point of view of anybody who would challenge the capitalist class, which is very small. And thus, by doing that, you would also prevent the formation of a political community. So you would do the opposite of what Jefferson wanted. So Thomas Jefferson's model, if we want to stay grounded in American politics, what did Jefferson say? That he envisioned America as a society of small shopkeepers and property holders who have a vested interest in coming to the common meetings, the commons, where they would have a meeting and then you would go and it would have this kind of democracy of the small property holders, who are certainly much greater in number than the very few capitalists, and thus you would actually have the trappings of a community. So Jefferson's model was much different than the model that won. But the model that won created a society that's not a society in the political sense, right? Yes, it came together, during the Civil War, but the Civil War was a radical threat, to the liberal project in America. Under Lincoln and the radical Republicans, of course. That was not a liberal project, as we know. So I think Foucault's reading opens up very interesting kind of readings of, for example, the Constitution and the entire genealogy of American politics, Yeah, Michael.
No, I was just going to say the Jeffersonian Constitution really is more reflected in his Rousseau background,
right?
And in Rousseauist reading and his connection to French, French thought. As you know, separation of powers comes from Montesquieu's Spirits of the Laws. So you have that. Property was guaranteed by Locke, who said there's the divine right. It ultimately is divinity that assures the notion of private property. And the Federalist number 10 is really about factionalism, right? How do you control, first of all, what are the causes of the faction?
Of class conflict, basically.
How do you control, class conflict, exactly. And then I'm just using Madison's language to be fair, like Foucault does, yes. But of course, how do you control class and class conflict and understand, first of all, its causes, and then, of course, the effects of this, right? So
and that you can't eliminate it. So you have to manage it. I mean, it's a governmentality and society of control. These people understood 200 years ago. You can't defeat the proletariat. You can't just, because that's the condition of your own wealth, right? Wage labor and free, exploitation of labor. So you have to control it. You have to manage the factions, And
think about it this way. There was not Medicare for all that happened in the 1930s. There was a pension plan. As long as you can survive, and they figured most of these people would die before the Social Security age, right? That was the first benefit that labor won in the United States. Medicare was the second, so you have a moment in the 30s and you have another moment in the early 60s. Those are the two benefits on the governmental level that basically labor won in the United States, right? And you basically had a Supreme Court Justice, Hugo Black, who actually advocated for the shortened hours work a week, right? Who was actually a Klan member before becoming, a great advocate of civil rights. And actually, he was the one who actually defended communists very subtly in the Dennis versus U.S. Case, in his dissenting opinion, when he said this represents no clear and present danger. And he had a very, very subtle argument. If you ever want to read a great defense without saying, I'm protecting the communists in the United States, because there is no clear and present, danger. So anyway, yeah. But I think this is it's very important to do this kind of reading of the Constitution. And, of course, then you have the third Constitution, which is, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which doesn't play out as Du Bois said. And this is interesting. Du Bois said the reason he doesn't vote, why did it take 100 years after the 14th Amendment to have equal protection under the laws? You had to have a Civil Rights Act to guarantee this in 1964. 100 years almost after, a whole century it took to get a civil rights bill on the books. And then the voting rights bill, right? And Du Bois is seeing this in the 50s, and, Gramsci, of course, saw it in the 20s, why vote? And then Sartre, writes Election Trap for Fools. So, yeah. And then, of course, you have the court of public opinion. How does that work? And that's what's really being eliminated here. Everybody wants these both wars to be stopped, right? In terms of a public opinion, the majority. This isn't listened to at all, right? Forget it. Yeah, forget it. Yeah, in a sense. What's happened here, in a sense? And, to go back and read Lippmann, again, is another way. Lippmann learned from, or Goebbels learned from Lippmann. How do you manage, public opinion? How do you manipulate it to the point of where it doesn't affect your program? Yeah. So I think
I think that and again, it's like we can't sidestep this fundamental political question. And how do we envision the political? And the answer of Homo Economicus is that there's no point in focusing on questions of the political understood to be the formation of a political community. The liberal project was not about that, because that would be the condition for its own impossibility, right? Because the guiding central idea would be something other, the irreducible idea would be something other than interest. It would have to be something else: freedom, justice, social equality, whatever, anything but interest. And so that in itself I found to be a very disconcerting and kind of I never thought about liberalism that way, because we're inundated with right, but the idea that the condition for possibility for liberal politics, for capitalist class hegemony, is the constant and persistent effort to prevent the formation of the political community, where the irreducible fundamental political category is anything but the interest. And if we do have a political community, there's no reason whatsoever for the fundamental political category to be interest, right? So this becomes something very useful, I think, to keep in mind. And is that still in operation? Of course it is. Of course it is. But has it changed from the cybernetic intervention if we start from the works of the pioneers of cybernetic, philosophers, like the people we mentioned last time? What does the introduction of this new techne do to what does it mean to be human? Well, it targets the question of human sense making, or the question of intelligence, right? And so, is interest still the foundational category, or has just the way human beings are not the only core of the fundamental question today, now all of a sudden we have this thing called simulated human intelligences, or that are self-learning, or soon will be able to be self-learning, artificial intelligence and generalized artificial intelligence, and etc. The human being is being displaced, right, as the ground of the political. It's being joined, if you will, or maybe even superseded by this other human created social object, at least in the minds of, I guess, the pioneering thinkers of this, right? Like Grundrisse and Buterin and many others. But then we should still investigate. I mean, I know it's already 2 hours, but maybe we can finish the Foucault next time, because we haven't even talked about the invisible hand, and also how the
relationship to the physiocrats too, and how he positions that in a very interesting way, as well. And because you can go back and read the sections in Capital on the physiocrats and Adam Smith and compare very well with Foucault on this, right?
And I think these pages, we should read maybe some of the longer quotes just to get the flavor of like page 278 and 279 and the beginning of 280, where he talks about he focuses on Adam Smith and the invisible hand, and what is actually meant by that in Foucault's view.
By the way, one of the fundamental books of business management is called The Visible Hand.
The Visible Hand.
Alfred Chandler. It's a very interesting book. It's used in management schools, in the business schools.
And I'm told Machiavelli's The Prince also is like a fundamental text.
Of course. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think going back to Homo Datum, it seems like, part of and what Jeff had mentioned, he's still here, about the expertise of the managerial class. Really, everything comes down to reading data. This is really the part of the Homo Datum. It's no longer reading through interpret. It's all reading data. This is what it's become, right? The reading of data. Yeah.
Right. And then, so what do we mean by data in this case? And what do we mean by the word by the datum? If we go back to the Latin,
it's the givens. So, and also, the dative case in language, as well.
The already formed. So that which is already formed. Okay, well, how do we explain its already formedness? I mean, through what conditions does something become, precipitated as an already formed object, which immediately has social functioning of such importance and such scale? I mean, or we surrender certain fundamental things to it. I mean, so I think we need to. It would be very useful to conceptualize data, as I mean, beyond the more banal, kind of more direct, or the way it's used in computer science or whatever, a container of information. Okay, but then what do you mean by information? So we can't avoid the concept of data. If we want to make sense of it. So I think that we should try to do that as well, or in this line of inquiry. But I think the sections, I don't know if we want to just read a little bit more before we end today, but the bottom of page 278, Foucault, asks, what is this invisible hand? Of course, he said what is the usual understanding of it? It's usually said that the invisible hand refers to a more or less well thought out economic optimism in Smith's thought, right? It is also usually said that we should see the invisible hand as the remains of a theological conception of the natural order. Right, that ultimately the buyer and the seller and the price will settle itself through some kind of a reasonableness that is ultimately enabled by the higher being. And though through the notion of the invisible hand, Smith would be someone who more or less implicitly fixed the empty, but nonetheless I always find with Foucault is always kind of, you stumble upon a profound passage without any preparation, it's all like off the cuff. Right. Through the notion of the invisible hand, Smith would be someone who more or less implicitly fixed the empty but nonetheless secretly occupied place of a providential God who would occupy the economic process a bit like Malebranche's God occupies the entire world, down to the least gesture of every individual, etc., etc. Smith's invisible hand would be something like this God, whose intelligible extension would not be occupied by lines, surfaces, and bodies, but by merchants, markets, of course, ships, carriages, and the roads. And that's the substitution, right? Of course, because he's speaking to that social class. And consequence of this would be the idea that there is an essential transparency in this economic world, and that if the totality of the process eludes each economic man, there is, however, a point where the whole is completely transparent. So he's saying we're encouraged by liberal thinkers to imagine that their view of the world still contains some kind of a totality. It's still kind of a society that they're talking about, right? When in fact there isn't, right? They're against this idea of a totality, of a society of people and everything that entails. Of the process illusion. Yeah.
No,
Go ahead. Yeah. I'm just
sorry.
gonna, yeah.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I was just gonna keep reading a little bit.
Yeah.
Who's completely transparent to a sort of gaze of someone whose invisible hand following the logic of his gaze, and what it sees draws together the threads of all those dispersed interests. So he's like, we're encouraged to think of capitalist economics as them suggesting that there is a society, of course, there is a common good, and therefore there is the requirement, if not a postulate, of the total transparency of the economic world. This is the suggestion, which of course is not true. Now, if we read the text a bit further on, what does Adam Smith say? In the sections that are not quoted by defenders of capitalist neoclassical economics or any kind of capitalist economics from the liberal point of view. He's speaking of those people who, without really knowing why or how, pursue their own interests and thus end up benefiting everyone. Each only thinks of his own gain. And in the end, the whole of industry benefits. But right, how can that be? That doesn't make any sense. I'm thinking about how to get rich, and I'm going to screw you over by selling you this, shitty car. How is that going to help the development of the community of New York City? You know what I mean? Like, it makes no sense. People, he says, only think of their own gain and do not think about the benefit of everyone. Is that you and me, though? Do we think of just our own personal gains? You know what I mean? I don't think so, And he adds that it is not always the worst for society that the end of benefiting all does not enter into the merchant's concerns. And then the quote, I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. It is an affectation indeed, not very common among merchants. We can say roughly, thank heaven people are only concerned about their interests. Thank heaven merchants are perfect egotists and rarely concern themselves with the public good, because that's when things start to go wrong. And then the crucial passage follows. So then Foucault says, so, in other words, there are two absolutely coupled elements here in Adam Smith's passage. For there to be certainty of collective benefit, for it to be certain that the greatest good is attained for the greatest number of people, not only is it possible, but it is absolutely necessary that each actor be blind with regard to this totality. Everyone must be uncertain with regard to the collective outcome. We shouldn't care about it while we're pursuing our individual goals, if this positive collective outcome is really to be expected. Being in the dark and the blindness of all the economic agents are absolutely necessary. Okay, so what are the consequences of this? The collective good must not be an objective. There you have it. It must not be an objective because it cannot be calculated, at least not within economic strategy. And thus, building a collective good, having a collective good, and cultivating a collective good is not part of the calculations of the liberals, i.e. of the capitalists. So don't expect collective goods to be high in the agenda in a liberal society. Good luck, get your own health care, make sure you save enough for your own pension. It's your own interests, after all. You don't want to be on the street. Don't expect social structures to exist. They're going to provide you with healthcare that's done in such a way because we don't believe that the collective good is something worth accomplishing, because by doing that, we're going to definitely harm the individual. They're mutually exclusive. The liberals won't tell you that. Adam Smith won't tell you that. John Locke won't tell you that directly. But the public good and liberal self-interest are mutually exclusive. So you either have a liberal society and you have shitty healthcare because it's run for individual gain by the capitalists who own it, or you have adequate and awesome healthcare, harnessing the full insights of modern science and industrial production of drugs and massive public education systems that are going to educate an army of doctors and nurses who are going to be left alone to practice medicine the way it should be in the interest of the patients. You will never get that in liberal society. Or you're going to get it halfway, like in France or in Germany, where every 10 years it's going to be attacked and all those social goods are going to be always under risk of cutting or whatever. And,
Yes, and you're beginning to see this attack on those kind of, socialist principles in Quebec. Now everything's going private. They want to do a new moment of privatization of healthcare,
constantly
keeping the
under
public
risk.
home. So this is happening globally now. Yeah. The American model slowly, like the Powell memo, it takes 40 years for this to come in. Yeah.
Indeed, like
Yeah.
like Beth says, that's
Yeah.
just the price for. So, but of course, if we go back to the uncomfortable conclusions from this kind of, I think one of the things that I think Foucault is teaching us is if somebody hates, if we have counter liberal politics and we believe in some kind of egalitarian politics, we need to attack the fundamental thinkers that enable liberal thinking and ideology. And that's what Foucault's doing. He's essentially showing how John Smith, Adam Smith, and John Locke, what was the true essence of their ideas, right? So we need to target, Foucault is saying, if you want to make headway against capitalist or liberal politics, you got to target the main figures, the main intellectual figures that are producing the framework for sense making for the capitalists and their servants, right? We need to target just like Marx did, right? In the intellectual warfare, right? But if we go back to the uncomfortable conclusions from this kind of analysis, exposing the true kernel of liberal politics, I think Phil suggested that in a comment above as well. This is a vision of constant war. These are people who recognize that their position of power and privilege, and even worse, that's just the way humans are, right? So a lot of these like this Andreessen manifesto, he says competition, is just the way forward. Competition is like war, right? Competition between people is like the way to a better world. War against everybody else constantly is the natural condition of what does it mean to be human. These people are dangerous. They're dangerous for the survival of human beings and the planet, because their viewpoint, their reading about what humans are and what politics is basically narrow self-interest, which produces competition, which produces fighting. And if we generalize that through large amounts of money under the possession of small groups of people, this produces constant war and pestilence. Yeah. So I think Foucault doesn't say that, but he says that by not saying it, right? In these lectures. These people are
certainly
dangerous.
setting a framework for it to be said by many other people after him who take up the biopolitical. Melinda Cooper's book, Life is Surplus, is a very good thing that you're talking about too, this whole Malthusian project, that life becomes surplus, becomes part of surplus value, if you will.
And what a better way of developing
yeah.
Malthusian surplus politics today,
Yes.
when you invent another social being, which is the digital social objects that are being created, powered by artificial intelligence. Your digital assistants, your digital sex objects, that's coming in pornography. Your digital virtual girlfriend or your digital pet, right? Once you do that, additional space is open for genocidal politics of actual humans, because all of a sudden we have a society with a new type of social participants, and all of a sudden it's getting crowded again. So the Malthusian demands are going to be placed again for yet another type of genocidal politics. So the risk of genocidal politics today is greater than, ever before, in a sense, or at least ever since World War II, since the last large-scale genocidal politics of the period.
Well,
I don't know.
That not the best note to end on, but we can continue, with this, next week. I think it's good to keep going over the Foucault to see the argument unfolding and the way he's going about trying to frame this, because he gets very much a bad mouth and criticized for somehow celebrating liberalism and celebrating neoliberalism. I do not find that to be his intention at all, if you read this carefully. I think it's very illuminating. I think it could be read alongside, especially volume 1 of Capital, the footnotes on Locke, the footnotes on, the physiocrats, the arguments, of course, with Smith and Ricardo, and he's very well aware of this. Remember, Foucault, is a French intellectual where the Communist Party had a very active role, especially during this period. And he writes this, by the way, in Negri's lectures too, or after the defeat of the left, the unity of the left's failure in 1978, to situate this within at least the French scene. And going back to what you were saying about education, it's interesting in France too. Professors aren't assassinated, usually in the West, right? I mean, you don't go into the class of David Harvey and he's not on the target list to be taken out because he's reading Capital. But Pierre Ouvernet, who worked at the Renault factory in France and, led strikes, etc., was assassinated because of the fact that the workers were really being educated. I mean, this was the whole thing of the Gramscian moment, the building of organic intellectuals actually on the assembly line in this. And you look at the history of labor struggle too. Those that read, those that practiced, study groups, etc., were much more powerful. The Chicago Teachers Union, they were reading Lukács. They had study groups on history and class consciousness. Drum in Detroit. So I think this is always important to remember, who are the targets then ultimately. It usually is among the generalized, among the proletariat, right? That this is happening. It's not happening in, quote, the Marxism of the chair or something like that, So I think, again, for us to understand this very well. Yeah. So, they didn't take Freud to the ghetto. Remember that. I mean, Freud was not really allowed to be taught in the ghetto, right? This is interesting to know during these periods, right? Categories of sublimation, repressive desublimation of Marcuse. These concepts did not travel further than kind of the academy in some ways. This is part of the problem that I see going forward. Yeah. So, yeah. And that the political consciousness of a Palestinian is about 100 times that of the political consciousness of an average American, So I mean, what are we doing, in a sense, right? And and I don't think it's accidental they shoot children. I think you're absolutely right, Arto. I mean, this is a genocidal moment, right? At least from that party in Israel. I'm not saying it's all.
We read about, because we don't live in a area like that, right? And you read about it, and you read about that kind of violence, and it's not violence, that kind of but when you just think about it, like,
right,
everybody dies in war, right? War is the worst thing that people are capable of inflicting upon each other, and there's always war should end, right? There should always be, and hopefully they should never start, right? And that's always the goal. And people who say, well, that's not reasonable, but just think about it, like, why shoot unarmed kid when you are far away? I don't know how far away, but of course, far away, complete safety. There's something else happening, and that's a line that once that's crossed systematically, it's a very bad place. It's a very bad place.
So do you want to continue with the two Foucault next week? And
sure.
I can also send out, I'll have Matt or Josh put it up, the last section of which I think is the best definition of biopolitics, even though these lectures are called The Birth of Biopolitics. The 1975 Society Must Be Defended, the last chapter of that. So I'll get Josh, when I see him to put it up.
And then maybe we can do Agamben, and
yeah,
then
and then we have Homo Sacer, the last section on the camp as paradigmatic of the modern era, right?
and then Michael, you said you had a provisional list of concepts.
I do. I have a thing
So
on cybernetics. I can put those
we should
out.
engage
Yeah,
in that
yeah.
too.
I'll engage in that. Yes, as well. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, no, this is a real turn, and people that really become interested in this. And again, I do not consider, some people do, biopolitics anti-Marxist. I think it's a very, very necessary supplement. I think it's something that was very under-theorized, and I think it goes on and becomes very, very dominant in many, many places, and to use these kind of genealogical methods in terms of looking at the medical complex, right? Epidemiology departments, how data is accumulated, articulated, presented, etc. Very, very important here in many ways. And I think Foucault's on to this, in a very profound way. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll go, we'll go, and then we can go back to the modern management too, and see this working now with the debates around who's to serve Microsoft best in terms of AI, right? The new Larry Summers, somebody put in the chat earlier. Was it you, Phil? That Larry Summers is now a board member of yeah.
Yeah, he's been brought on to OpenAI that so that he can make sure things are run right.
That's good. I'm glad to hear we're in good hands as usual. Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting too. Foucault goes from it's kind of interesting in this book. There's more of the hand. I like to think sometimes like Nietzsche, the body itself, the hand, the invisible hand, and he'll go through this constantly. Whereas the panopticon, that other moment of English imperialism, the eye, the eye is underway. So it's kind of interesting, this fusion of Lacan's gaze, Merleau-Ponty's notion of the eye, and then of course Heidegger's notion of the hand and the Begriffen, that one grasps concepts by the hand. It's kind of very interesting, how he does this. I'm just reading him, very speculatively here, but I think it's interesting in terms of those two organs, whereas Marcuse always liked smell, as one of the sense organs to work with. But eye and hand is very interesting here. Yeah. Hand-eye coordination, huh? Yeah, as they say in athletics, right? Yeah. Yeah. So okay.
So what's our reading for next time?
We're going to continue with the March 28th and April 4th lectures of Foucault. We can expand them a little bit. I know Arvid brought up Adams Ferguson, who is very important on the notion of civil society not being a community. Again,
and that's exactly
so what Arto's doing here. We don't have a political community, so this whole concept of civil society and
which is not a political community, as Michael said. We should talk about this, because
we'll talk about that.
Civil society is the absence of a political community. That's not where we want to be. We don't want to live in civil society. We want to live in a political community. Like if we keep these categories,
Yeah, and I mean, he's obviously coming out of pretty deep reading of Hegel's philosophy of right, an early work on the administrative class, on the bureaucratic order of that time. Again, going back to the German address to the nation state, to the nationalism that's operative there, right? Yeah, address to the German nation. Again, very important. And then I thought we'd also maybe start trying to tackle, Agamben. Again, not so popular with historical materialists, but I think Homo Sacer is very good, and we'll have to develop a little more the notion of the sovereign, because, it's the sovereign and bare life. What is bare life for Giorgio Agamben? And what Arto is called, what did you call it, biologically?
Biological beings with human capacities.
With human capacities.
That's maybe the next stage of the generalized proletariat.
Yes, exactly.
That's where we're going.
Right, exactly. Well, Black Lives Matter, not Black Power matters. but Black lives, right? And I got in trouble for saying that was a degeneration of a kind of insult to the dignity of Afro Americans or Black people in general. But anyway, yeah.
So
Slogans are important. We learned that from Nietzsche and Lenin together.
what's
Slogans
important?
are very
Oh,
important.
slogans.
Sloganeering,
Yeah.
very important. Yeah. And I'll give you the reading. I'll tell you where it is. But I'll get Josh to post it, Beth. It'll be on the Institute site. Yeah. But let me just tell you where it is. I got to get the book.
Yeah. So I think at some point, as we're wrestling with these things, we're hoping that some new useful concepts will suggest themselves to us, like data, working definition of data, if you will, and related concepts will emerge as part of this kind of reading and thinking about.
The book is entitled "Society Must Be Defended." It's lectures he did in 1975-76, 3 years before these. I'm going to pick out one chapter that I think is crucial for us to understand, the biopolitical. It's actually the 17th of March, 1976. But I'll put that out in an email, and then the text will be up. So it's 17th March, 1976, pages 239. No, my apologies. 239 to 250. I'm sorry, 263.
But is this for next week or no? Next week we'll continue.
I mean, we can go beyond. Yeah, we can go the week after. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
Or do you want to?
What you're talking about, genocide. He has a very, very beautiful thing on what he says. Power no longer recognizes death. Power literally ignores death. And he talks about this very, very, very deeply, how power really operates in this notion of what you're talking about, ultimately genocide, right?
So, Michael, do you want to? And of course, he titles it "Society Must Be Defended," given what the
community.
liberals are. Yeah, community, exactly. But he doesn't say the civil society. He doesn't.
Right.
Say,
No, not civil society, but society must be defended.
So, Michael,
right?
do you want to continue with these lectures for Foucault and add this other one for next?
Yeah, we can add the other one for next.
So we'll
week.
just add. We'll add.
Yeah,
We'll
add
upload.
this.
We'll email. People will get an email with the PDF, just like we did for this one.
Yes, because I think this is something that was overlooked in terms of the biopolitical movement. This was kind of an omission that they did not go back. People like Esposito and Thomas Lem and others who became sort of the stars of the movement did not really engage this. I mean, first of all, you love this, Arto. The first question he asked, "What is a lecture?" Right. I mean, and you can see his Heideggerian influence here in many ways, and also the kind of subtle Marx that comes in, but it's really Nietzsche and Heidegger that are very influential here. So yes, this is the 10th of March. This is very interesting. This 17th of March, the power of sovereignty to the power over life, i.e. biopolitics. Make live and let die. From man as body to man as species, the birth of biopower. Biopower's fields of application, then population, going back to the Malthusian project that you alluded to, and ultimately, what we today call genocide of death, and the death of Franco in particular. This is interesting too. Yeah. So we'll post this. We'll
post it, and we'll read it next time. In addition to the finishing up what we read today. The two Foucault lectures from 78, 79, and then we'll add this new one. We'll send the PDF, and we'll post it on the website as well.
Right. It'll be posted on the website. Josh will do that. Yes, but we can send out the PDF. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Arto. That was great today.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Moving us along. Yeah. Yeah.
Let me
Yeah.
just stop
And
the
thanks
recording.
everybody for the chat. Please feel free to chime in and raise the hand and etc. Sebastian, by the way, we're going to do the Greece thing